introduction. So my name's Dr. Casey McCarthy. I'm the beef cow-calf specialist. Myself and my colleague, Dr. Mary Dronowski, are on hosting our fall webinar series. We're really glad and excited to have you all joining us for our first talk of our series this fall, where Dr. Jay Parsons is going to be talking about decision-making, specifically trying to target some decision-making processes during drought. So we are really excited about the opportunity for our webinar series topics to really dive into some of these concepts and strategies. And so I will turn the floor over to Jay.
All right, thanks, Casey. So we'll go ahead and get started here. And, the topic is decision-making during drought. I do want to emphasize the word during. So a lot of the context will be focused on decisions that people are trying to make today, but I can't help myself but, emphasize that the best time to plan for drought is before it happens with a good drought management plan. So I'll try to sprinkle a little bit of that in there too, or I guess I should say I can't help but sprinkle a little bit of that in there too. So even though you might be making some tough choices right now, you can always learn from those choices and help build a more resilient drought management plan maybe for next time around also. But so what kind of decisions are people trying to make these days, with this drought that we're experiencing throughout the state? Well, the best resource I have is our schedule of upcoming programs. So I'm going to focus on decision-making itself and the process and way to think through things tonight. And our upcoming webinar series, we got 4 more webinars in this series on Tuesday nights. And starting next week, Dr. Casey McCarthy will be talking about decisions for culling cows and heifers and utilizing pregnancy detection. Which is, certainly the culling decision and what to sell and what to do with the size of your herd and so on is a big choice that people are making. And then the next week, Dr. Mary Dronowski will talk about making the most of your hay supplies, more of the feed side of things. And then on November 1, Dr. Carla Wilkie is going to talk about tips for confined feeding success. And then we'll round it out on November 8th. With Dr. Travis Molinix hosting a profitability roundtable with some producers talking about ways to reduce costs. So a good, portfolio of topics there discussing some of the decisions that people are making. But decision-making itself, when it comes to making decisions in agriculture, they can be challenging even in the best of times. And certainly where we're dealing right now with a drought situation and high markets and inflation and all that kind of stuff happening, they become, somewhat doubly complex at this point in time. So anyway, as we think through ag decisions in general, though, some of the challenges that we face are, the massive uncertainty that we really deal with on a day-to-day basis with weather and markets in particular. Whether it's a drought or a flood or a winter storm or whatever the case may be, we don't have control over that stuff. In a large part, most all of our production is taking place out in the elements, where it's really susceptible to those events. So that certainly adds a lot of complexity to the choices that we make when we have things out of our control like that. And in a lot of ways, in most ways, actually, markets are also out of our control because we're predominantly producing food and people can only eat so much. So when ag producers produce a lot of food, we see our prices go down quite a bit because people can't just eat more because we have a lot. So oversupply basically has a tremendous downward pressure on prices that we see. And then in the other direction, when we're undersupplied, like when we have a drought like we have now, or the worldwide events like we have with the war going on over in Europe that's affecting some grain markets, we see prices spike higher. And so we have some volatility in our marketplace there just because we have some inelasticity there in terms of the amount that people are able to consume of food products. So we got that uncertainty floating around within our operations that makes decisions certainly challenging. We also have lots of choices. Might not seem like that at times, but but there's a lot of nuances with some of the different choices that we could make. We're going to cull cows. When are you going to cull cows? How many are you going to cull? Things like that, all the different dimensions to it. And I don't want to say that lots of choices is a bad thing, because certainly having choices is a good thing. We don't want to be boxed into a corner and only have one choice, but it does add complexity to the situation. Then also, we're usually dealing with I should say usually, a lot of the ag operations are family operations, and they come in multiple ranges of sizes, which add other complexity because you got different voices, different people's opinions on what you should or shouldn't do. You have financial concerns, whether the operations are supporting several families, as a full-time income, or maybe they're just supporting one or two families with part-time income. There's a lot of different dynamics there that can make things complex too. And then the government seems to intervene a lot in agriculture, either with incentive programs or disaster programs. Incentive programs, a lot of are things like EQIP and stuff like that we see on a regular basis. But then also crop insurance would fall under that in terms of the subsidies that the government provides there to incentivize people to purchase crop insurance. And I'll mention a little bit more about that towards the end of the presentation. And then there's also disaster programs that weigh in. And of course, the one that's on people's minds now, right, is our forage program, the LFP program, livestock forage program, that basically pays out in a drought. And we saw some big payouts back it was 2014 when they hit, but they pertain to that 2012 drought. And for those of you that can remember back then, we had about 2.5 years worth of drought disaster program payments all come out when that 2014 farm bill finally got approved. So those are different things that come in different ways. And in some sense, when somebody hands you money when you need it, that's certainly a good thing. But it also means that things maybe don't work the way you might anticipate they would work, because there's money flowing into the system, maybe from different angles. And in some cases, especially with some of the one-off payments that the government tends to do, sometimes maybe it's unexpected, but the government intervention is there, and it's also there on the trade side. I didn't list that as a bullet point, but it can come in and affect markets, certainly, when it comes to trade. But overall, we just have a really complex production system and an economic system with the biology and environmental issues going on, and then some of the economic components, and then your own personal financial situation and how that handles or interacts with the financial markets. And of course, one of the aspects there that's a challenge currently is rising interest rates in response to inflation. So anyway, so the bottom line is that agriculture is a very challenging environment to make decisions in. And so there's an incentive then to build decision-making skills. And if that doesn't motivate you enough on the wanting to build your decision-making skills and say, how should I think through this? Hopefully these 4 bullet points kind of drive home the point. And the first one is that, by making choices, that's really your only way to purposely influence your life. If you otherwise you're just not making choices, you're sitting back and letting things happen to you. And sometimes it feels like that we are doing that, but you stop and think about it. And even in some minor situations, you're actually, or what seem like minor situations, you're actually making decisions that have a pretty big influence on how your day goes, how your week goes, and then ultimately how your life goes. They're also your opportunity in that context to earn a competitive advantage over your competition, right? If you can make better decisions than somebody next to you, then you earn a competitive advantage over them. You're better prepared for them in the case of a drought, for example, or your response to it is better than theirs. That type of stuff, so that you are able to basically be competitive in the very competitive world that we have in agriculture. They're your opportunity then to maximize your probability of achieving your goals and objectives. Of course, the unspoken first step in that is to actually have goals and objectives, and I'll mention that a little bit more here in a moment. But studies have shown that people who actually write down goals are much more successful in business and in life in general. And so that's a plug for that. Sometimes it can seem a little silly, and it's like you're holding yourself accountable and so on and so forth. But it's important to write down reminders of what it is you're trying to achieve, so that when crises or difficult moments come up like we have right now during a drought, that you can stay on course and keep yourself headed in the direction that you'd really like to go, rather than jumping off course without really thinking it through. And then the last one is one that I really think is super important, and that is that if you build up good decision-making skills, your decisions, making better decisions, shapes a better environment in the future for you to make choices in. So putting yourself in good financial situation, actually, that actually makes a lot of different decisions easier down the road when you have that safety net to fall back on, or other alternatives, or flexibility even within your production system to work with. But they're really your opportunity to present a better environment for you to make better choices in the future. Like I said, nobody wants to be boxed in with very limited opportunity to choose. Okay, so this is the decision-making process that I teach and I use it in the classroom, use it out in extension. I've dubbed it Smart Choices in Agriculture. There's a story behind that, but we don't have time for that here tonight, so I'll just leave it at that. It's built to actually result in what I call the 7 characteristics of a good decision. Okay, and so I'll run through these quickly. The first one is to have an appropriate decision frame, which is, there's all these boxes over here on the right in the graphic. It's really the idea that you know what your opportunity to make a choice is about, that you understand the context in which you're making it, and that you understand the alternatives available to you. So really these first 3 boxes here, the green one on top, the blue larger one, and then the green one here with the alternatives, that's really putting a frame around the choice that you're trying to make. There's other nuances to it, but that's the main piece. And in major decisions, it's super important that you do that so that you understand all the different components. As you move through life, you make a lot of fairly simple decisions, but if you do this aspect of framing decisions properly and get into those habits, that you'll find yourself even doing that on the simple decisions, and some of those will turn out even better for you. The second one is to have clear values to adhere to and objectives you are trying to accomplish. And as I mentioned, I'll get into that a little bit more here in a moment, but it's knowing what you want to accomplish by making that choice, that you have creative alternatives to choose from. And so I always tell people you can't make a choice that you haven't thought about. So you want to be creative, come up with a good set of alternatives, and most people are not too good at that. We tend to only identify about half of what the choices are that we have available to us. So certainly getting good at that is a big part of becoming a better decision maker. The fourth one, to have good information. That seems automatic that we need to have that. Certainly we know that. But part of having good information is a willingness to communicate with people and consult with people inside and outside your organization, and getting that information flowing around in your head, and then also with other decision makers on your operation, so that we like to say you're all on the same page, but you don't have to be on the same page. You need to basically be on the same page in terms of gathering information that you can then coalesce around and make a good choice with. Okay, eventually you can get to a choice of consensus, but arguments is what I mean to say. Sometimes arguments can generate new and valuable information just as much as a cordial conversation. So clear trade-offs and sound reasoning is when you get down to actually assessing them. That's what you see down here in the yellow box. And again, that's flows from having good information to work with and understanding what you're trying to achieve. And then choice alignment with values and objectives. So once you make a decision, making sure it aligns with things that are important to you. And just a caveat, when I teach this in the classroom, I understand these are early 20s students and stuff. We go through exercises like this in class with some different decisions, and probably about a third of them will eventually make a choice, but they can't justify it with their objectives. So they've lost total track of what they're actually trying to achieve. It's revealed itself as a part of the decision-making process. So they've identified some things that are really important to them, but they haven't really thought about actually articulating those things as being important to them. And an example would be, in that case, would be students deciding where to take a job or what job to take. And it turns out that location is really important to them, specifically location relative to family. And they haven't even, been bold enough to actually state that case, that they would like to be close to home or something like that. And then finally, if you do all this well, and you've thought it through, commitment to implementation doesn't come automatically, but it does come a lot easier. If you have people involved and providing good information, discussing trade-offs, arguing it through, and eventually coming to a choice, tend to be a lot more committed to actually making that choice a reality, because you put a lot of effort into making it. So that's the process I advocate for. And again, for major decisions, I think it's a super good process. And if you use it for those major decisions, you'll have a pretty clear understanding of things that are important to you, the objectives that you're trying to achieve. You have a much better understanding of the internal and external context that you're dealing with in your operation and the risks involved. And you'll be able to reuse that context that you're working with there over and over again, a little more automatically, as you go through the days and the weeks making choices. So I want to talk just a moment about one of the important principles here that I'm trying to get across to folks, and that is being proactive with your decision making and looking at them as opportunities. We tend to, a lot of times when it comes to making choices, we recognize the choice because we recognize that we have alternatives to choose from, right? I could sell cows or not sell cows. So sometimes it's just a yes, no type of choice. That's usually what generates the decision, but we don't want it to stop there, right? We want to move and take that extra step to move into the discussion of why do we want to choose? What are we trying to achieve by making that choice? And in doing so, mentally, we'd like to put objectives ahead of alternatives. Okay, so we'd like to get to the point where we are recognizing things that are important to us, and then we are recognizing alternatives that help us achieve those things. And so that's hidden behind here in some respects, because we have to have a decision before we can start a decision-making process, so to speak. But if we get really good at thinking through choices, we'll get really zeroed in on those things that are important that we're trying to achieve and the connections between some of those things, because there'll be several things in the long run that we'll recognize, and we'll start to recognize alternatives that help us achieve that. And that's when we know we've really grown as a decision maker. And that's where I say a drought risk management plan comes into play, because some of these best things that you can do to manage drought is you got to do them ahead of time, right? Before forage becomes scarce, for example. So that's why we're working to do that. So how do you go about then putting objectives first and identifying those? There's some practical things to remember. And one of them is that those objectives are personal. So when you have a farm situation and multiple people involved, there might be some disagreement on what's important or what's most important. And it's important to have those discussions among your group. Okay, so even though you might end up having to cordially agree to disagree to a certain level, at least you all understand what's motivating each other in terms of the decisions and the choices. So that's one thing, is that there's a personal component to that. The other thing is you shouldn't limit them to just what you have available for current information or that you can easily obtain, because some of these things involve measurement. So a lot of times we look at what we want to accomplish and we say, well, I don't know what that is, but we kind of know how to measure it, but realize we're going to have to measure it over a period of time to see if what the trends are working or what's a reasonable objective or goal to attach to that. Realize that not everything, the information is going to be readily available. I might have to go hunt for it someplace or talk to some experts, or might have to measure it on my operation for a little while to see how that works out. But once you get those objectives set, you can reuse them, because if they're good objectives, they'll basically work themselves through and show up in other decisions. They'll become a kind of a stable set of objectives that you use over and over again. So there will be some antagonistic, some trade-offs among them, right? I can't necessarily always be a profit maximizer, because there's other things that are important to me. I know if I cut my costs, I might be cutting my level of production that I have. I know if I try to maximize production, I'm going to be increasing my costs. There's some antagonistic things working there. But certainly having those discussions and thinking about those is an important piece, so you can know what it is that you're trying to accomplish and what the trade-offs are in the actual choices that you make. So what are some examples you might be thinking through right now? Okay, this is just some, I think pretty much most producers talk about, making money, right? All things else being equal, I want to make the most money I can. And that has two components, always minimizing cost and maximizing revenue. So what are we going to do in that regard, right? And on the revenue side, there's the price component. We certainly want the highest price possible, but we also know that if we take that risk and try to guess the market, that we're basically could miss, right? So there's trade-offs there in terms of how we do that, but all else being equal, we want the highest price possible. We also want the highest production possible. Well, right now we're sitting in a situation where we got some high costs attached to things. We got some really good prices, but we have some strains on production, predominantly that we have a drought, we have some forage resource issues, and certainly, if we go to purchase those, we're going to have to pay for them, which is going to drive up our costs. So how do we do that in this situation? I'm sure that's on a lot of people's mind. Minimizing risk. It's a little late to minimize the risk of a drought, and certainly we can't minimize the probability of a drought. But we can help work on the impact of it. And I'm going to mention a few things here as we go through that you can maybe consider doing ahead of time to help minimize that impact. But then there's other things that can come in play. Certainly on the financial side, there might be some probability concerns there in terms of being able to pay down debt or pay, whether it be a bank note or input supplier or something like that. But, the probability that you're going to be able to pay all your financial obligations and so on would fit under that play too. Some of you might be wondering about whether or not to maintain your cow herd numbers into the coming year. I've got some things to think about as we go through there. And then certainly, the range condition, because this year, we know range conditions are really bad. What are they going to look like in 2023? We don't want this year to ruin next year and so on. So there's year-to-year things there. And there's probably a lot of other things that people are concerned with there. We did have some people talk about insurance in here. Pros and cons of risk insurance from private insurance companies. I'll mention PRF, pasture range and forage insurance here in a moment, because I do a lot of education on that right now. But some of those are out there. Livestock risk protection insurance is one of those things out there. But some of those can come in there. Now, insurance might lower the probability of maybe some financial issue coming up. They don't necessarily lower the probability of, like I said, bad weather, but they can help you with the impact or dealing with the impact of that. And that's a transfer mechanism to move it out to folks. Of course, some people are worried about just purchase of feed right now too, and do you buy it ahead of time or wait? And again, that's we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but certainly there's some issues there that are on the financial side to consider, the timing of when you buy feed and so on. Because if you buy it this year, you can quite possibly write all that off as an expense this year against some income, and it could have some tax consequences or favorable tax consequences to you, versus waiting to see what happens in the spring and so on. So a lot of trade-offs there to consider as we go through that and think about in terms of your own situation. But that's what you want to think through at this point as you're making decisions, is what am I trying to accomplish with this? And this is just kind of a beginning starting point of some of those things in terms of where you want to be long-term on your cow herd numbers, your range condition, your financial situation, and so on. Okay, so the objectives is the first part of that, establishing the context. The other three things to do are to get a good handle on what you have internally to deal with, what the external situation is or the external contacts, and then risk identification. In other words, what are the uncertainties? So I just wrote down a quick list here. So if I was to do that, establishing context, I would first of all list what I want to accomplish as my objectives. I would start writing down the situation that I'm dealing with on my operation, range conditions, perhaps at the top of the list, other grazing resources I have available. What is my fencing situation, especially around the other grazing resources? One can assume that you have your range, at least with a perimeter fence, but overall, do I need to do something on the fencing side? Am I all set up for that to fence off a field of forage or crop aftermath that I can graze and so on? What does your stored feed inventories look like? What am I working with there as a possibility or not? What's your own cattle inventory look like, and where do you want it to head in the years to come? And then what's your labor situation? If you cut your cattle herd down, or you just trying to spread labor across fewer number of head, or maybe not. I don't know. Maybe you're down people, and that makes sense to you. But what is your situation there this year and in the coming years where you'd like to be there? And then, of course, your current financial situation. And this late in the year, we're also always thinking a little bit about taxes. What's on the external side, what's the area around you look like in terms of forage availability, whether it be harvested forage in terms of hay, prices and availability, or grazing resources in terms of prices and availability? What do I have available out there to work with? What does the national cattle markets look like in inventories? What effects that going to have on prices? What's the weather forecast look like? And then things like the USDA disaster programs, what's available there in my county, and maybe some insurance options. But this is one you have to think of proactively ahead of time as part of a drought risk management plan. And then on top of all of these things, you don't have to list all these, but this is just a laundry list of things to think about. What are some of the uncertainties about some of these things? And I usually, if you're not sure where to go there, think of a worst case and a best case and a most likely scenario with some of these situations, whether it be in the markets, whether it be, with your range conditions and where they might be next year and so on, or your labor situation and how that might work out. So that's the idea, to just give you a base of information to work with. So if you have that on your fingertips, you can just write some of that information down. If you need to go look some things up, you go look it up. So one of the things right now on the range condition side that people are looking at is the Drought Monitor. And of course, Nebraska is pretty much all in drought, and a lot of it is in severe drought. I happen to look at the range condition report, and Nebraska is 80% in poor or very poor condition in terms of the range. There's pretty much nothing in excellent condition. Oklahoma's kind of in the same boat. Kansas is in a similar boat. So if you go south from here, it's tough to find any grass, let's put it that way. So that's the current situation there as far as what's going on perennial grass pasture ranges. Now, there's other caveats to that when they start opening up CRP for grazing and things like that you might have available to think about, but with certainly a lot of concern right now with our current range conditions. So what are we seeing people do? A lot of people, of course, are pulling cattle off the range, and a lot of people are selling cows. So we're seeing a reduction in the cow herd when we talk about the cattle inventory numbers around the state. And this is the reduction from January of 2021 to January of 2022, about 48,000 head less in Nebraska in terms of beef cows, a little over 1% change there. That's probably going to be triple that at least this year, because we see a lot, because that drought has persisted and prices have strengthened. So we see a lot more people selling off cows. So we're going to see cow numbers go down. We know that. And we know it's going to take a while to build back the herd. So when we think of external conditions, we need to take that into account. What happens when you have fewer beef cows? You also obviously have fewer feeder cattle. So this was the likewise change in feeder cattle supply outside of feedlots. We'll also see this go down more this year. And if you want to put that in the context of the calf crop, this is our graph of the calf crop. So we're down in some pretty low territory right now for our projected calf crop for 2022, right? We lost 1% of our cows, we lose about 1.4% of our calves. And so everything inventory wise is looking down, right? Fewer numbers. So we're seeing strong prices go with this, and that's why. So we're out of forage, people are selling off animals. So that's the external situation. The other thing I keep track of fairly closely is what people are basically holding back is beef cow replacements. And this is a pretty telling sign that we're going to continue on into next year with fewer cows, because we don't have people holding back heifers. 2022 is looking down 3.5%. If you look back historically, this is a pretty low number. This is for the U.S. as a whole, though. This isn't just Nebraska. But these are pretty low numbers here that we're seeing in terms of heifer replacements. So, like I said, people are selling off because we got high prices reflected in our steer calf prices here. I could have plucked just about any price path off here. for different ones, but we'll see the dark blue line represents 2022, and it's tracking significantly above last year, which is the dotted blue line, and well above our 5-year average, which is the dark red line here from 2016 through 2020. So high prices, low forage, incentive to sell, and we're seeing that happen with the numbers. But what do we project is going to happen? Well, we went through this in 2012, 2013, and then on into 14 and 15. We'll see inventories go down. These high prices persist, and an incentive to basically rebuild the herd when the forage returns is probably what's going to happen, right? It's the timing of it that we're not sure of. So for some people, they're asking, how do I persist through this? How do I make it through? Well, it's a little late now to add cash to the coffer, so to speak, with insurance programs, but that's certainly something I recommend people consider as a part of their risk management plans as far as drought goes. And the one that I do the most education on, the two actually are the livestock risk protection insurance and the rainfall index insurance, particularly in the form of pasture rangeland forage insurance, or PRF. And those are all offered through the risk management agency at USDA. They're proactive policies, right? You got to buy them ahead of time. And then if things don't turn out, in the case of LRP, if prices turn lower than expected, then they would pay you an indemnity. In the case of rainfall index insurance, if you don't get rainfall, they would pay you an indemnity. If I had to give advice, it would be go back and buy PRF if you could, right? But you can't. Moving forward, I think that's something to establish as a part of people's risk management plan that depend a lot on rainfall to produce the grass they need to grow their cattle. I also think that people need to be, if you aren't involved with livestock risk protection at this point, it's a good opportunity, or it's a good timing for you to learn more about it and think about perhaps making that part of your plan, because as we rebuild the herd, we know that the prices are going to go down at some point. It's a matter of when. And so that's the type of protection that you can put in place to help protect you against those drops in prices, especially if you have to, put yourself in maybe a little bit of financial stress to get through the current times. The other programs are what we call disaster programs, and this is where that livestock forage disaster assistance program comes in place, or LFP. That's administered through the Farm Service Agency. I think every county in Nebraska has that in place right now. Don't quote me on that. Several of them have you can get up to 5 months of grazing partially paid for on that. And I think there's several counties that are all the way maxed out at this point. So that's something to check into. But I'll give you just a few words on PRF, and then we'll get to some questions here that people might have, because this is something that we're getting a lot of questions on right now, because the sign-up deadline for this is December 1. So if you want PRF for 2023, you have to sign up by December 1 of this year, so within the next couple of months here, in order to have that in place. So it's too late to put it in now. This is one thing that I advocate for people to put in place on a regular basis if they want this protection. It's for perennial forage. So predominantly in Nebraska, we see people put this on pasture and rangeland, but it can also go on hayland. And so there's different pricing for that in terms of just the dollar value you can put on, but the product itself works the same. It is a rainfall index. So the grids are 0.25 degrees by 0.25 degrees. It's about 17 by 17 miles at the equator. It's about 12 miles wide by 16 miles north to south in Nebraska. So it's basically what is the rainfall in that grid area during any 2-month interval, and that's what you're insuring against. And you can insure up to 90% of what they call normal rainfall, which is just a long-term average for that 2-month period. The kicker of it is that it's subsidized at 51 to 59%. So they're required to charge you an actuarially fair premium, which is basically a premium that reflects what they expect to pay out. And when I say charge you, they charge that, the government pays half of it. So you pay less than half of that premium. So we are seeing a lot of people lot of interest in these policies. This is the data from 2013 when it first started to 2022. Pasture range and forage was available prior to 2013, but it wasn't a rainfall index policy at that point. But in any regards, we see a big uptake on this. It's more than doubled in the last 3 years in terms of the number of policies that people have taken out. You can see that most of that interest is because those policies are being paid. You know, prior to that, 2018 and 19, only about half of them were indemnified. Now we're seeing about 90% of them indemnified. The number of acres, we're up to about 4.5 million acres this year that are insured. And we're seeing a lot of indemnities being paid out. $30 million has already been paid out this year so far. That's through the report on October 11th. So I think that would cover through like the end of July, if I remember right, on what's been paid out so far, because there's about a 45-60 day lag in them paying it out. But we've seen in the last 3 years, 2020, 2021, and 2022, producers have been getting about a 2-to-1 payout, over a 2-to-1 payout on that. For $1 premium, they're getting more than $2 back in the last 3 years. Now, it's not always going to work that way. I mentioned 18 and 19, it was, you know, low usage of it, but it was also low payout. The years prior to that, it was pretty solid at a 1-to-1 ratio. So I don't know how long this is going to persist, but I do know that in the long run, you know, we've seen about $1.70 paid out for $1 paid in. And I've looked at these in a number of different places around the country. And it ranges in that 150, 160 range, pretty regular. And that's because it's subsidized, right? It should pay you out more than you pay in because they're paying half of your premium for you. So we've seen that in place. So just to kind of think about this as we go through and we establish the context, then the next step, if we have all that stuff in place and we see all those things, is just think about all those alternatives. And PRF is one of them that would be a proactive alternative for next year to think through. Some other alternatives that you're probably thinking of right now, culling cows and heifers and pregnancy detection. I'm kind of going down the list of the things that are going to be talked about in the coming weeks. But thinking about what you want to do there. I've mentioned things about the, where you want your cow number, you personally want your cow numbers to go. And if you're thinking that you, say 3 or 4 years from now, you want your cow numbers to be, a little bit higher what you have today, perhaps culling right now might not be the best choice unless you have some other reasons, production reasons, right? So you're trying to change your the type of cows you have. Maybe you have some poor performing cows and now's a good time to get them out and so on. While the coal prices are high, or the pregnancy detection, certainly if you have something open. But I wouldn't necessarily just capitalize on those high prices now, because if you're really looking to have cow numbers above where you are today in cow numbers, if you're looking for that in the next 3 years, you're going to have to pay quite a bit to rebuild it up to those numbers if you cool down too far. So keep that in mind as you make your choices. Feeding hay or any other resource could be in there in terms of is that available? Does that meet the nutritional needs and so on and so forth? How's that going to work? Early weaning. A lot of people are selling calves early this year. We're seeing quite a few flow into the feedlots earlier than normal, and through the sale yards and changing ownership hands earlier than normal. Does that fit where you want to be, or are there other opportunities you want to take advantage of that? Haven't gotten a lot of questions about shipping cows and calves to the feed resources. As I already mentioned, going south is probably not a very good option at this point because they don't have feed resources either. For the most part, the weather people say the drought is creeping to the east. I don't know what that means long term because the west of us has been in a drought for so long, it's hard to tell. But anyway, that might be an option that you're thinking of. And that depends upon your situation and where you might be able to find those. The other piece of advice on generating alternatives is to iterate to better options when they're available. And that's part of the discussions that you can have. So you might think you have your options all outlined, and in discussion to somebody with somebody else about it, they point out something you hadn't thought of. Can you take something that you have, iterate it to perhaps a better choice, and so on. So maybe it's not feeding hay, maybe there's some other feed resource you hadn't thought of, for example, or maybe it's a combination of of heavy culling and getting some feed resources or shipping cows. But again, proactive is better than waiting till you're in a crisis. So some of these things like PRF is now time to sign up for that if you're interested in it. The feed resource situation, give that some thought as maybe in the future, some things that you could maybe do differently and so on that might make you better off if next year or the year after it turns out to be dry too. But we know no drought will return at some point. Okay, so I'll end with this, and that is that when you make decisions, you want to obviously make good decisions, but as part of that, it's a good idea, especially with drought, to remind ourselves that we want to keep a good risk management culture. And part of that is anticipating decisions, right? Being prepared to make decisions before you have to or before some of the best choices have gone away. So don't avoid decisions. Keep in mind what you're trying to achieve and look for those opportunities to make choices that help you achieve that. So that you're the first to the game and can make the best choices. Also have adequate resources and the capacity to respond. And that goes with the free flow of information into and throughout the organization. So some of that is basically having boots on the ground, people gathering good information and people willing to help you implement decisions and so on. Good experts to draw information from into the organization and good people in your organization to share and discuss. And of course, the discussion means nothing if you don't learn and adapt and update things as you go. And then finally, keep that risk management, those uncertainties embedded in your decision-making process. So just because we have high prices today doesn't mean it's going to persist. We know it's going to turn around at some point. So keep that in mind as you move forward and you think about these decisions and where you want to be, not just today, but in the future in terms of as you work your way through this drought. Okay. So it looks like we got several questions coming in, and let's see what I have here to look at. Okay. So
Yeah, you've got a couple, Jay,
yeah,
in there in the chat.
I just pick and choose which ones to go with, and feel free to type in some other questions if you have them. I know we have quite a few or several people on at least. So go ahead and type them in there. I might not be able to answer them, but I'm sure it'll present some good discussion here. So some people, let's see, culled some older problem cows. Of course, those are the ones you want to get rid of, even though they're pregnant. Hopefully you got a little extra for those, kept some extra replacement heifers. So it sounds like a trade-off. They're going to eat less now and will give me more calves going forward, just trying to maintain herd size. Thoughts? Well, as you probably guessed from my comments, my recommendation is if you want to maintain herd size, and I'm thinking 3-5 years down the road, I would not recommend doing things now to reduce your herd size because it's going to be expensive to rebuild it. And so if you can maintain it now, that's the thing to do if that's where you want to be looking down the road. I would hesitate to say resist the temptation to cash out, but that's essentially what I'm saying. If you're looking to reduce your herd size 3 or 5 years, that equation's change. You might want to consider obviously going ahead and doing it now while prices are good, but not if you're, don't reduce it now if you want to keep it strong or grow it in the near future. Private insurance, if you're talking about PRF and LRP, I think those are good options. They're government supported. They're offered through private insurance companies, but the government pays a significant amount of the premium for you for both of those. PRF is a strategic decision because you can't wait till a drought hits to put it in place. So I always emphasize that December 1 sign-up deadline. And if all of that looks like something you might want to do, sit down, come up with a plan and stick with it. Don't bounce in and out of that insurance because that's one that long run, you'll come out ahead, but you got to stick with it and come up with a plan that matches your needs, which is basically, and there's ways to do that. There's online tools. We have workshops on it, and I'd be happy to help you work through that or look at it for you. The LRP is something, as I mentioned, that maybe not right away because we're still kind of in an upward trend on prices. But certainly it's definitely something to consider as you think ahead in your 2023 calf crop. We're going to see things turned around, and understand LRP, the price insurance actually pays off, maybe not as much, but just as often in upward trends as it does downward. And I know that probably doesn't make sense to you, but sometimes we get over exuberant with where we think prices are headed when they're headed up. And so they predict, so prices still go up, they just don't go up quite as high as what people think. So keep that in mind too. And again, but that's a sensitivity on your own financial situation, if you need that protection or not. And we tend not to think about it in upward price movement situations, but we don't know when we're going to go over that cliff and things are going to come down. So always keep that in mind. And certainly in the next 2 years, I guarantee that you're going to, if you buy LRP at some point in there, you're going to be glad you did.
If you have questions for any of our speakers during our series, you can reach out to Mary or myself, and we'd be happy to address those and send those to our speakers as well if you do have some questions after tonight.
Yeah, and if I could put in a plug, all of us are extension folks, so we interact with producers regularly, and usually it's around a decision. I mean, most often. And do not be afraid to tell us what you're trying to accomplish. It doesn't matter. I mean, we've heard all kinds of things that people are doing or not doing or trying to do. But that's one of the most important pieces of information we can have is the things that you are trying to accomplish with your decisions. Just telling us what you have and what you're thinking of doing is only part of it, but making it clear what it is that you want to accomplish, especially in the short, not just short one, but long run too, because it can make a big difference on what advice you get from us.